Welcome to the first of two press conferences planned by the Saint Lucia National Reparations Committee to coincide with the royal visits to the Caribbean by members of the royal family on the occasion of the observance of the Platinum Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth, which represents her 70th year on the throne as not just the Queen of England, but also the Queen of the Commonwealth, and by that extension, the head of state of Saint Lucia, whom the Governor General of Saint Lucia and every other Caricom member state that is not a republic also represents. Our press conference today is prior to the arrival of the royal couple tomorrow for the two-day visit. And as you probably know, St. Lucia is their base. They arrived there on Friday and were welcomed by Deputy Prime Minister Dr. Ernest Hilaire. And from St. Lucia's base, they traveled last weekend to St. Vincent and the Grenadines, returned here on Sunday, attended Mass at the Holy Trinity Anglican Church, which is the local arm of the Church of England, to which the royal family begins. And after that, on Monday yesterday, they went off to Antigua and Barbuda, where they are today as well, and will be returning to St. Lucia possibly this evening to start tomorrow's two-day activity in terms of the royal visit to St. Lucia. You will also note that since the budget had already been prepared long in advance of the visits, it so happens that the entire visit, but also St. Lucia's 2 days, will coincide with the presentation and debate of the policy aspects of the budget, which is going to be the first to be presented by Prime Minister Philip J. Pierre 8 months after the last general election. Certainly you will also have found, as members of the press, whether from what we saw on Street Vibes or what we have been getting from people who we ask about their opinion on the royal visit. It is not one to say that St. Lucians have ignored the royal visit, but rather it is one where in this post-COVID period and coming just after the global effects of the Ukraine war, the St. Lucians everywhere in the Caribbean, St. Lucians here and everyone else in the Caribbean are more interested today and tomorrow in how to survive the current periods, which reflect higher prices and make the cost of living that much more every time we go to the supermarket. So in the context of the Prime Minister's presentation of the budget this afternoon, we are having this press conference this morning, which will be live streamed at, I don't know if I use the proper term, which will be streamed from 1 p.m. internationally on Calabash TV. And for the purposes of today's press conference, what we will be doing is introducing the other members of the National Reparations Committee who are here with us. Bongo Wisely Taparai, who is a member, a founding member of the NRC and also the chair of the Caribbean Rastafari Organization, CRO, which is represented on the Saint Lucia National Reparations Committee since its inception in 2013. Also present is Nkrumah Lucian, history lecturer at the St. Mary's College, and who is responsible for taking care of our communications and education aspects. And both of these gentlemen along with other members of the committee, were also very much involved in the participation in and execution of our historic 1 year of national reparations lectures in Saint Lucia, which became a regional event whereby on the third Thursday of every month, our national reparations lecture in Saint Lucia was beamed 12 times to schools across the Caribbean. And in light of the success of that initiative, the NRC is looking to ensure that we can resume that series of lectures in the time to come. Today we will be focusing not necessarily on the royal visit to Saint Lucia, because it hasn't happened. It will start tomorrow. But what we are doing today is taking advantage of the opportunity to address the issues that the Caricom Reparations Commission and the Caribbean community, Caricom heads of government, are addressing insofar as the call for reparations, which was made in 2013. So for the past 8 years, this Saint Lucia National Reparations Committee has survived 3 administrations. And we are there for the institutional knowledge. We are the institutional entity responsible for ensuring that St. Lucians are up to date on reparations. And that is why we are treating the royal visit not as a special occasion for us, but a special occasion to allow us to address the issues we want St. Lucians to bear in mind before, during, and after the royal visit. And that starts off with the fact that St. Lucia, like all the other 13 member states of Caricom, are party to the call on Britain and the other European territories that belong to the European Union, which benefited from slavery, to be able to apologize and make the necessary redress. And that is why our member, Wisely Taparai, will be addressing the issue of why St. Lucia and other CARICOM territories are calling for an apology and not just royal expressions of sorrow and regret. We will explain why we are insisting on an apology, and Wisely will explain the difference between an apology, which is what we're looking for, vis-a-vis expressions of regret and sorrow, which we have been getting and which we are saying is not enough.
Yeah, well, Bongo Wisely Tafarai, as was stated earlier by the chairman of the CRC, a member of the National Reparations Committee, also the chairman of the Caribbean Rastafari Organization. Also, I would like to add, I'm also a member of an elder within the Theocracy Reign Order of the Nyabingi in Ayanola, St. Lucia, and also a member of the Global African Congress, an institution which evolved following the 2001 Conference Against Racism in South Africa. Give thanks. So I'm here today to share with the media and those listening the role of the royal family in transatlantic slave trade, slavery, and native genocide. For most of us, we all should be aware by now that in 2001, transatlantic slave trade, slavery, and native genocide were considered a crime against humanity by the United Nations. And as a result of that being a crime against humanity, there is need for redress. There is need for compensation. There is need for reparations. Also, I want to let it be known clearly as well that with crimes against humanity, there are no statutes of limitations. With crimes against humanity, no national law can legalize or justify crimes against humanity. So when in 2001, the British delegation came to South Africa on the pretext that the British Parliament had legalized slavery, so there was no need for us to talk about redress and so on. They were denying the fact because they are fully aware that national laws cannot legitimize crimes against humanity. So when Tony Blair and David Cameron would come down in the Caribbean and tell us, time to move on, man. We are not responsible. That was years ago and so on and so on. We cannot buy into them things, brothers and sisters. As I said, the time for reparation is now. And now that the royal family are on their visit to the Caribbean, we feel that the time is appropriate that we address some of those issues. And as I say, the role of the royal family in transatlantic slave trade. I want to start off by quoting one of the British parliamentarians who participated in the bicentenary debate for the abolition of slave trade, Mr. Vincent Cable, and I quote, "The slave trade was at the center, not the periphery, but at the center of British economy, and it was the basis for the property of the church as well as the royal family." So transatlantic slave trade was one of the bases for the proceeds of the royal family, from Mr. Vincent Cable. Brothers and sisters, it may be difficult for us to really be able to identify or to estimate the current wealth of the royal family and to determine what amount came as a result of transatlantic slave trade. But we are fully aware that the proceeds of slavery was involved. It funded the British Treasury. The British Treasury, which was responsible for the payment of civil servants, most of government activities, operations, and so on, came from the Treasury. And the transatlantic slave trade played a pivotal role in funding the British Treasury. The industries which sprang up, we all know about the Industrial Revolution. The raw materials which financed or sustained the Industrial Revolution came from the plantations. So without those raw material, the Industrial Revolution would not have been what it was. So transatlantic slave trade played a very crucial role. Even the buildings in England, today England is famous for all them high-rise buildings, skyscrapers, and so on. All of these things came as a result of the proceeds from slavery. The buildings, the roads, the parks, the railways, which England is famous for today, all of these things came about as a result of the proceeds of slavery. From school days, we learned about John Hawkins from primary school. John Hawkins, Henry Morgan, Christopher Columbus, William Wilberforce, and all of those things. We were taught that these were great men we should be aspiring to be like. John Hawkins made 3 trips to Africa in 1560. And on those trips, he captured our ancestors, stole them, brought them back to the West, and sold them into slavery on the Americas. Following his return to England, his profits were so handsome that the Queen of England at the time, Queen Elizabeth I, she was impressed that she decided to invest with John Hawkins. Invest more money in his business, in his adventure. Provided more ships for John Hawkins. And one of the ships provided is the infamous SS Jesus of Lubeck, the slave ship Jesus of Lubeck, where our ancestors were told that Jesus would be coming to take you all from bondage and bring you all to a land of milk and honey, referring to the plantations in the West. You see how deeply involved the royal family were involved in slavery. The SS Jesus, that ship was specifically named SS Jesus of Lubeck. You know, and it's on that most of the mercenaries, or we call them missionaries and so on, whatever, base the fact that Jesus will come to take you all from hell and bring you all to heaven, a land of milk and honey. And we know what happened on the plantation. You know. Today, the descendants of John Hawkins, as well as the Queen of England, are still alive today and living and benefiting from the proceeds of slavery. Yes. Even all now, that tour which is happening, you know, for the royal family to be able to finance such a tour. The proceeds of slavery is deeply involved in it. Yeah. And they are the same ones who will tell you, well, no, well, we're not responsible for slavery. That happened long time ago, and this and that and so on. No. The proceeds, you all are still there benefiting from it. Yes. After that investment by Queen Elizabeth I, John Hawkins returned to Africa, still more Africans, and came back. His venture was productive, it was prosperous. As a result, the Queen of England decided to knight John Hawkins. He became a knight, which means that she was so impressed with his proceedings, his venture, his business, his investment. You know, she endorsed it. You know, she saw it as something good, something worthwhile. Hence the reason why she see the need to knight John Hawkins at this time, you know. And today, out of those proceedings, those investments, which the royal family, John Hawkins and company, continued, the Royal African Company was established, a business entity to continue the whole business of going and steal Africans on the mainland and come and sell them on the plantation. The Royal African Company was formed, and one of the leaders of that company was the Duke of York, who later became James II. I'm not too sure whether he became king, but he was James II, the Duke of York. And every African that was transported under the auspices of the Royal African Company were branded with the thing DY after the Duke of York, meaning that the Duke of York owned those individuals. DY, Duke of York. But sometimes when I listen to our culture queen, Madame Cécile Descartes, she has a song, Mama Ela Diwai encore. It now have me wondering whether that DY is related to the Duke of York, because they were the ones who owned Saint Lucia, because Saint Lucia, although we see it was 7 times British, 7 times French, but our time under the British, I've heard, because as a little boy, I've heard about the Duke of York and so on, even when Earl was talking about how the Duke of York, he have 10,000 men and this and that, and you know, I've heard them little stories coming up. So that DY encore could well be paying tribute to the Duke of York. So that is why we need to be very careful within our culture, you know, what we put out and what we embrace. Because sometimes, as we would say within Rastafari, you end up being a vulture to the culture. Because if as our culture we're promoting the works of the Duke of York, that's not supposed to be in favor of I&I. Because look, right now, they refuse to acknowledge the fact that they were responsible for transatlantic slave trade. You know, so they're living in denial. Between 1660 and 1690, within a period of 30 years alone, 3 decades, the Royal African Company was responsible for trafficking over 6 million Africans to the Americas. And every African had a price tag on their head. So you could imagine the amount of monies, of profits that the RAC has made or was making on our African people. That's between 1660 and 1690. Now the slave trade continued until 1807. So the RAC was involved in trafficking of our ancestors from that time until the abolition of slave trade. So in terms of the profits, here they speak of the 6 million within a 30-year period. So going up to the abolition of slave trade, that number could be triple, you know, but they all triple the amount of people that were brought in, you know, and they were labeled DY, you know, so that is their trademark. So all of that shows that the royal family, as well as the British Parliament, endorsed and embraced transatlantic slave trade. And it was being protected by the British Parliament, as well as the royal family, you know. In closing, brethren, I want to share the sentiments of one Professor Corinne Fowler, who is an academic at the University of Leicester. She specializes in Britain's colonial legacies, and she states that the royal family now has an opportunity to show leadership by acknowledging its involvement in transatlantic slave trade, by making a formal apology, and then asking openly and humbly, what can the royal family do to begin repairing the damage done? Making the formal apology. Well, we've heard the royal family going around and say, well, they're sorry and this and that. It's a very sad day within our life to see what happened and so on. But they never want to really accept the need for a formal apology. Because with an apology, it means that you've admitted, you've accepted, you've acknowledged your role within whatever happens. And which means that you are prepared now to take responsibility. So in a day like today where transparency and accountability is the order of the day, the royal family need to show likewise. They need to acknowledge their role, because that cannot be hidden anymore. The role of the royal family in transatlantic slave trade. It cannot be hidden anymore. So the time is now for the royal family to offer that formal apology as recommended by the Caricom Reparations Commission in the 10-point plan. The first one is an apology, because with the apology, now the doors will be open for negotiation, the roundtable discussion, and so on in terms of how that reparations can be implemented. Because reparation does not necessarily mean just cash money being paid. As can be seen within the 10-point plan which Caricom has presented. Number 1 is an apology. Number 2 is repatriation. Now that is one which is very close to our heart as Rastafari. Because from the beginning, from the time of emancipation, our ancestors were clamoring to return to Africa. There were those who wanted to remain, but there were those who wanted to return. Because even during the time of John Hawkins and them taking the Africans away, they were told as it was like they were going on a mission and with the intention to return. But with emancipation, we know what happened. The planters were compensated for losing their stock, their workers. Whereas the workers who are the victim, who provide all the resources, all the income, they never received a cent. So today, the Rastafari community is grateful that the Caricom governments in 2013 agreed to embrace the need for reparations. And we are fully on board with the Caricom governments. And even we are prepared right now to take it to a wider level, to globalize the whole reparations campaign. Because it's not only Caricom that suffered from slavery, transatlantic slavery. You know, there are other islands, even some of us from here, we went to other parts of Europe. You know, so the whole reparation thing needs to be globalized. And Africa itself, as the motherland, needs to be part of that conversation. Again, as Rastafari, we give thanks that last year we saw the first convening of the African Union and Caricom Summit. And we're looking forward to the next one. September 7th has now been designated as Caricom African Union Day. And for repatriation, reparations to be a reality, Africa, the mainland, and the diaspora must come together as one for these things to happen. It cannot be in isolation. So the Caricom strategy, we embrace it, we give thanks, but we need to widen it and globalize it to make it a reality. With that, again, I say I give thanks for the opportunity. There will be time for more questions, and we are prepared to entertain whatever questions that the item would come with. So I give thanks, Rastafari.
Without going through each of the 10 points, I will just give you the topic as to what each 10 points stand for, and wisely pointed out the very first, is for a full and formal apology, and he explained why to St. Lucians and to everybody viewing at home and abroad, why Caricom is demanding a full and formal apology first and foremost. And number 2, we want indigenous peoples development, because the call is for reparations for slavery and native genocide. Before slavery, in order to create the conditions for slavery, the Europeans committed genocide. They wiped out the first people. They destroyed civilizations that preceded their own and taught us that Caribs and Arawaks were wild people eating each other. But what they did was they destroyed not only their existence in the region, but the Mayan and Aztec civilizations in the Americas were also destroyed. So we have to commit to indigenous peoples development. 3, funding for repatriation to Africa. As wisely pointed out, the Rastafari movement from day one has been championing the need for people of African descent to know that you are an African wherever you are, but also those who want to return to Africa can go there. 4, the establishment of cultural institutions and the return of our cultural heritage. Number 5, assistance in remedying the public health crisis, whether we want to talk about smallpox, which started in this region when the enslavers planted smallpox in blankets that were circulated to indigenous people to introduce those illnesses that are still with us. Education programs, number 6, we need to be able to develop so that our people could understand from whence we cometh in order to determine where we are heading. Number 7, the enhancement of historical and cultural knowledge exchanges, not only between us and the Caribbean, but between the Caribbean and Africa, and between the Caribbean and Africa and the African diaspora, including Caribbean people abroad. Number 8, psychological rehabilitation as a result of the transition of trauma. The trauma that we went through will be highlighted by Nkrumah, who is going to be explaining to us the examples of not just calls for reparations, but where reparations have been made, have been paid, and have been half paid. Number 9, the right to development through the use of technology. During the days of slavery, the British insisted that not a nail must be produced in the West Indies, that the sole role of the West Indies was to produce the raw materials that would be sold to ensure that they can grease the wheels of the Industrial Revolution. And number 10, debt cancellation and monetary compensation. We are being told that we owe the countries that enslaved us and put us in the economic situation that we're in. We don't only want those debts cancelled, we also want monetary compensation by way of reparations, and all of that to go within the demand for reparations for reparatory justice. As wisely pointed out, it's not just about the money, but about instituting Sir Arthur Lewis's development plan, which he put together in 1939 in the book called Labor in the West Indies, which, like I said, Caricom has adopted as the template for reparations whenever we get it. And it's my pleasure to present Senator Ali Gill, Grenada's ambassador to the Oecs and Caricom. Senator Gill.
And I bring greetings and salutations from Grenada to all of the comrades here in Saint Lucia, the leadership of the Saint Lucia National Reparations Committee, and to all Saint Lucians. I believe that we are in a very opportune time, a momentous time in our history, because the reparation struggle, I believe, has taken root and is blossoming throughout the region. Maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it was not as prominent as it is now. Most CARICOM countries now do have a reparations committee / commission. And of course, our heads of government in 2013 established what is now known as the CARICOM Reparations Commission. And most of the territories, with the exception of 1 or 2, do have chapters of the Reparations Committee. Now, I said opportune because now we have visiting our shores for the past couple months or so different members of the royal family. I call them the British oligarchs. They have visited other islands and now they are in Eastern Caribbean. They were supposed to visit Grenada today, the 26th, and without an explanation at the very last minute, they cancelled the trip to Grenada. And of course, that has made news globally and in London and throughout the region. Why is it that the Earl and Countess of Wessex has cancelled the Grenadian leg of the Caribbean tour. And as I painstakingly explained to the British press over the last couple of days, we cannot speak as to the reason or reasons why they would have cancelled their trip to Grenada. But I can say to you, maybe there were two factors that persuaded them that Grenada may not be the best place to visit at this time. Over the last week, the first reason is over the last week or so, the Bank of England has made it public. They commissioned a research, and that research found that the Bank of England, now owned by Her Majesty's government, had owned 599 slaves and 2 plantations in Grenada. Now, what that means to us is seriously grounding this call for reparations for us in Grenada. In other words, you have a major British financial institution that profited massively from owning enslaved Africans and exploiting the resources of Grenada, the soil, the land of Grenada. In other words, for persons who believe that this talk of reparative justice is pie in the sky, and these Rastafarians and these so-called black conscious fellas and so on just talking, no, they can see for themselves, in the case of Grenada, that while for years we spoke about we being responsible for building these cities, the city of London, and the Rastafarian brethren who spoke before me spoke about the buildings and the cities and the bridges and the roads. We have said that all the time. But here it is, that the Bank of England has profited directly from owning enslaved Africans and plantations in Grenada. They later sold it to other private investors. So you can see that this conversation we are having today with regards to reparative justice is not pie in the sky. It's well grounded in historical facts. The second thing that happened before this planned visit was cancelled was that we, in the Grenada National Reparations Committee, wrote to the Governor General, the Queen's representative, on learning that these royals had a planned visit to Grenada. We wrote to the Governor General asking for an audience with the royal couple. An audience so that we can discuss the issue of reparations. In other words, we have the considered view that the days for when these royals visiting the Caribbean for school children to line the streets and to wave flags and to sing God Save the Queen, we believe the days for that has long gone. And when they come here, we must sit around the table to have a serious discussion about reparative justice and issues of national development. So we wrote to the Governor General for that audience. And we said to her, we'd like to present two things to the Earl and Countess of Wessex. The first one, the Caricom 10-point plan referred to, so that they can see for themselves that when we speak of reparative justice, we are not simply speaking about writing a check. And Mr. Earl was at pains to further elucidate this 10-point Caricom plan, and Brother Wise, who spoke before him, had mentioned it. The first thing we ask for is a full apology, which means an acceptance that what you did was wrong, which means that you accept that the Atlantic slave trade and slavery was a crime against humanity, which means also that you participated in the genocide of our indigenous populations, the Kalinago and the Arawak people, the first peoples who inherit this world, so that they themselves, and this is also based on the Christian principles, you know. When we go to church and we ask for forgiveness and so on, when we ask for forgiveness, it's an admission of sin. For you to be forgiven in Christian teachings, you must accept that you have sinned and fall short, so too the royal family and the government and people of Great Britain must accept that they have sinned and fall short. That's where it begins. Forgiveness begins with an acceptance of guilt, that you have done wrong. And that's the first thing we're asking from them. But we wanted to present to them the 10-point Caricom plan. And we also wanted to present to them the latest publication by Professor Hilary Beckles entitled How Britain Underdeveloped the Caribbean. So they can read for themselves the hard facts of what transpired here in the Caribbean right up to independence and continuing. Because persons have to understand that not just the Atlantic slave trade, not just slavery, but the entire colonial political system was a systemic and institutionalized regime that ensured that the Caribbean continued to remain in a state of persistent poverty right up until independence. And you see it in how our economy is designed. Our economy is institutionalized in a way that we continue to export raw materials, like banana in the case of Saint Lucia for years. Rather than making our own potato chips and developing manufacturing sectors here in the Caribbean, in Saint Lucia and Grenada for years, we have continued to be exporters of raw materials to Europe. That is not by accident. We continue to be service providers for persons and so on visiting our shores in the hospitality sector. That is not by accident. And as such, even after the abolition of the slave trade, even after the abolition of slavery, our entire economic system has been driven to service the metropole and to service the capitalistic structure in Europe and North America. So that the Earl and Countess of Wessex and so on, they must understand the lasting legacy of their political relationship with us here in the Caribbean. So we wanted to have that conversation with them. We have not been afforded as yet a response. Well, we know now that that trip has been cancelled, so that we will not be meeting with them, but we have not been afforded, for the records, a response from the Governor General's office. And we believe that those two issues must have conspired as to why that trip to Grenada was cancelled. But you in Saint Lucia have had the privilege that the trip is still on, and they are here. I believe officially they will be visiting Saint Lucia tomorrow and the day after, so that the leaders here in Saint Lucia have an opportunity to have a conversation with them. And as the Antiguan Prime Minister pointed out to them, ask them respectfully to use their good offices to speak to the Queen and so with regards to reparative justice. What we need is a conversation. What we need is that the issue of reparations to be spoken on the round table in Buckingham Palace, in Westminster Abbey, at the United Nations, and to all seats and halls of power in the world. Similarly, just as how Germany has paid billions of dollars in reparative justice to the Jews, just similarly as it has made offer to Namibia with regards to reparative justice for what the Germans has done to the people, the government and people of Namibia, so too we believe that the issue of reparations is rightfully owned and owed to we, the people of Saint Lucia, Grenada, and the rest of the Caribbean. So I want to thank the Saint Lucia Reparations Commission for its kind invitation, for allowing me to use this platform, and I bring further salutations to the comrades here in Saint Lucia, and to say today that the struggle continues. Alta continua. Thank you, comrade.
So before we go further ado, I'd like to introduce our final speaker for this morning, and he is, like I said earlier, Nkrumah Lucian, a member, founder member of the committee, and also lecturer in history at St. Mary's College, the college that produced Sir Arthur Lewis and Derek Walcott. Over to Nkrumah
All right, good morning to all.
Good morning.
All right. Yes. Okay, now the issue of reparations, the issue of enslavement and colonialism, on the platform of reparations has not been something that has been very present in the Caribbean. Okay, apart from Rastafari and other like-minded groups, that has not really been in the mainstream. Okay, and because of that, persons may view reparations as something that is foreign, something that is not the norm, something that is not even possible. Okay? So what my job here is to do is to just look at a few cases in which the issue of reparations has been dealt with. Some of them which have passed, some of them which are current. Just to give an idea of where has reparations been, what is happening with reparations, what are the possibilities where reparations is concerned. Now, the best known case of reparations, of course, is the case concerning Germany providing reparations to the Jews and to the state of Israel. Something that began decades ago and continues even now. To date, billions of dollars have been paid to victims of the Holocaust and to the state of Israel as part of reparations. Another significant part of it, which I think is also relevant to us here, is that with that reparation, there was an aspect of it that involves education. That in Germany now, and even in places like the United States, you can't go to school and not have learned about the Holocaust. And that is one of the issues with even reparations now. If you go to England, many students go to school and never learn properly about what took place under slavery and colonialism, and therefore it makes it difficult for people to think about why reparations is that significant. What's the connection of Britain's present with the past? Okay, another case that is significant and also close to the one I previously mentioned is the reparations paid to victims of Japanese internment. Okay, what happened was, shortly after the attack in Pearl Harbor, thousands of Japanese descendants, some of them who were actually American citizens, were put into internment camps in the US and kept there for a period of time until the end of the war. Okay, and for decades they requested reparations. It was not until 1988 when an official apology was actually given by Ronald Reagan, and reparations have been paid. Compensation has been paid to the various victims of that misdeed that was done to them. Okay, so these are two examples of reparations that have taken place. I also want to mention briefly in the US as well, where persons have sought compensation. We have the case of the 1923 attack on the town of Rosewood. There's a film about it, persons may know about, where that community was attacked, persons were killed, their property destroyed. These persons were able to eventually get a compensation package, okay, in the millions. Another one that is also well known and also that has been portrayed in film is the so-called Tuskegee Experiment, okay, where between 1932 and 72, you had persons who were being given the impression that they were being treated for syphilis and were not, and were simply being observed to see how that disease actually progresses. Okay? So you have these examples. Now, over the decades, over the last few decades, a number of factors have led to increased efforts to explore historical wrongs and the effects, both in the African continent, the US, and of course now in the Caribbean. One of the things, of course, which led to that was the persistent calls of particular groups like the Rastafari, other like-minded groups that have been focusing on those issues. You also had what Bongo wisely mentioned about the UN Conference on Racism that actually brought it to on an international scale and established the idea that, of course, this is a crime against humanity and something that needs to be addressed. So that has brought it to the fore. You also had in 2008 where the US issued an apology for their own system of laws that are known as the Jim Crow laws, where they've openly practiced discrimination against Africans. Now, since then, you have had a number of cases that have come up and I want to mention two of them. One was mentioned earlier by Senator Gill, which took place recently, where there was compensation sought by the government of Namibia from Germany on behalf of the Nama and Herero groups, okay, in Germany, who were the victim of what is known as the first genocide, because it happened actually prior to what took place in Germany, where those two groups were systematically decimated. Large percentage of their populations were actually killed. They were, of course, dispossessed of their land. All right, and recently, Germany officially acknowledged that it was an act of genocide and offered compensation. Okay, so you had this case. Another one closer to home is in 2004. This one, of course, was not awarded, which is the request by then President Jean-Bertrand Aristide, 2004, where he asked that France pay reparations to Haiti. As you may know or may not know, France actually insisted that they be paid reparations after the Haitians fought for their slavery. And what essentially they were saying is that having lost the property, and that is very significant to our case, because what is being said, it sends a particular message, that France was saying, our planters have actually lost their property and therefore you must pay us. And among that property, they were of course counting the Africans who were enslaved on their plantations. Okay, so France actually insisted that Haiti paid, and of course at that time Haiti was one of the few independent black countries in this part of the world, and of course there was solidarity among various countries at the time, the European and the US, etc., that led Haiti to pay this. And Haiti continued to have to pay the loans that funded this thing all the way into the 1900s. Okay, so that of course was not awarded. The next year after requesting this in 2003, Jean-Bertrand Aristide was actually removed as president in 2004. And not only that, he was removed from the Caribbean and brought to first Central African Republic and later to South Africa. And of course, there's a lot more to that story, which I would encourage you to check out. Okay, so we have these two cases. Now, I want to mention two other things here. Apart from the official government request for reparations, there are also cases that from citizen groups who were themselves victims of or descendants of them. These have had the effect of both widening the discussion of these historical wrongs and of how they are dealt with through the inclusion of more grassroots voices. So in Namibia, we have cases that are being brought up by, Kenya, I want to mention first. In Kenya, you have two groups, two clans from the Nandi people who are saying that they are requesting reparations for property that was taken. What really took place? There was a case recently, some years ago, where the Mau Mau, you may know of the Mau Mau who fought against British colonialism in Kenya. And of course, a lot of abuses were done to them, including things like sterilization. Some of them were killed, etc. And they sought compensation, which was awarded. However, as you would appreciate, colonialism was much bigger than just that fight that was being made by the Mau Mau, and it affected a lot of people. So we have the Talai and the Kipsigis people, who, what happened to them was they were simply taken off their land and the land taken from them. Okay? And not only, they were also put in detention camps, and that land has not been returned to them. So they are saying that they are seeking reparations for that. Just on a side note, the Talai, I learned, we know that there are certain groups in Africa that are very well known for the long distance running and these things. This is actually one of those groups, and that situation was actually highlighted in dealing with one of their runners. So we have this case. You also have in Namibia. You also have groups that are still pushing for further compensation. Descendants of those groups, the Herero, the Nama, who were decimated in that first genocide. And And of course, so with both of them, you have the issue of access to land. When reparations is mentioned, it is spoken about that slavery was a thing of the past, but we have to recognize that even in the present, we see manifestations of those things. Access to land in the Caribbean, it's directly connected with slavery and colonialism. You have the plantations that were owned way back in that time. There was no effort to provide land to persons after that. So these are just one example of things that are connected from then to now. Now, the final example that I want to give, of course, it's an ongoing situation of the African Americans who are seeking reparations, and that has been pursued for a long time. What progress they have made is getting an act passed, which is called HR 40, or the Commission to Study and Develop Reparations Proposals for African Americans Act. And what that act is dealing with is basically saying we are passing this act to permit or to put in place the study of that experience, enslavement of the African Americans and how it has impacted them. And from that, they can then pursue what form should reparation take, and these things. And I want to emphasize that last point because I think it's important for people to appreciate that we can sometimes look at reparations in a one-dimensional way. But apart from the cause of reparations, the form in which it takes, from the examples I've given, it can take a variety of forms. When you examine the issues involved, it can be determined how should reparation be pursued. Okay? Now, there's a scholar by the name of Ta-Nehisi Coates. He was all over the mainstream media, so maybe very, very well familiar with him. And in his testimony before the Congress in connection with this bill, he was making the point that slavery is not just a thing of the past. Apart from the fact that you have continued prejudices, etc., that have impacted people today, there is also the benefit, not only the negative effect, but the benefit that has come down through the society from that time. Okay, he has a very long essay, I should say a very elaborate discussion of the case of reparations. It's actually called the Case for Reparations, and it should be easy to access on Google, that I would strongly recommend as pertains to their case. All right, now, reparations is now on the table across the world. It requires all involved to look critically at the past to more critically approach the present. It opens the opportunity to place present relations on a more just footing. Dealt with honestly and with integrity, it would allow for us to move from a relationship wherein our countries were seen as destitute and in need of aid, without any reference to the historical context which produced some of these circumstances, to one where this history is properly acknowledged and the proper basis for our current state of affairs is used both to understand and to act on it. Okay? Finally, it is important for us to understand reparations in its wider context, to examine similarities, differences, connections, etc., to other cases in the world. We will be exploring among other issues over the next few months. Now, I just want to, as the chairman mentioned, we have been pursuing efforts at education and informing people for a while, for the last few years. A lot of those lectures, etc., are available online. We also have a Facebook page which is updated regularly. That's Saint Lucia National Reparations Committee. And over the next few months, we are going to be dealing with things like this. What are the other cases of reparations? Understanding things. A lot of people, for instance, seem to mix up the idea of reparations and repatriation, both of which are part of the 10-point plan. Things like that we will also be presenting. So I want to encourage you to check out our page and to look out for the various other activities that we'll be pursuing. And also as the media to deal with the reparations issue in a very in-depth and contextual way where we can see how those things connect. Okay? So thanks for your attention.
We've been protesting all our lives. When has a protest led to the sort of change that we are looking for? We are not against protests, but the Caricom Reparations Committee took a position that every national entity will decide how best to respond. Some have decided to have protests, some have not gone the protest way. We have decided that the way we are going to go about it is to allow the government to speak to the royal family on behalf of Saint Lucia, because that is their responsibility. Our responsibility is to get Saint Lucians to understand why the royal visit is taking place, why Caricom, including Saint Lucia, is asking for reparations, and most importantly, to let you know that after the royal couple leaves, the struggle will continue, and our plans include a follow-up press conference on the 3rd of May after they have left, to point out to you what we plan to do between now and May Day and Emancipation Month, all the way up to the 7th of September, when there will be the 2nd African Union CARICOM Summit. So thank you for your contributions, and like I said, we also have the contributions of Ambassador Dr. June Suma, which will be added in this broadcast for the attention of St. Lucians at home and abroad, and Caribbean people and audiences the world over who are watching this video right now.
Why are Caribbean nationals? Why is CARICOM? Why is St. Lucia asking for reparations? The fact is, if we were not enslaved, we would not have been calling for reparations and demanding reparations for more than 400 years of forced labor. I know that you're saying 400 years, but we were only enslaved for a certain amount of time, up to 1838. But I want to say that the trauma that we have suffered because of native genocide and because of enslavement remains with us today. So in CARICOM, in St. Lucia, we are asking for us to repair that damage. We are asking for justice. We are asking for atonement. We are asking for you to make amends. We are asking for reparations. The Caribbean Reparations Commission, established by the governments, has recognized that there is a legal, there's a political, there's a social dimension to reparations that we must address in all of our countries. If we have to take, for example, the issue of an apology, after so many years of enslavement, all other countries in the world where there was an enslavement, where there was this kind of trauma, have received an apology, and people of African descent cannot receive an apology because of the fact that from enslavement, we were not seen as human beings. We were not seen as human beings, and therefore we cannot be deserving of an apology. The disrespect is still there. The disrespect remains, and the disrespect is growing. And it is time for people of African descent, for the people who were the original natives of this Caribbean, for us to be granted reparations. Another important truth that we must recognize is that the slave trade and enslavement is responsible for the wealth of Europe, is responsible for the wealth of Britain, is responsible for the wealth of the royals. It is responsible for entrenching racism in the world. It is responsible for the thinking and the continued thinking that black people are only 3/5 of people. And it is responsible for ensuring that the current institutional arrangements, whether they be financial, legal, constitutional, continue to oppress the people of the Caribbean. So we need reparations for this now. St. Lucians have always recognized that we could not breathe under this oppression. We remember that we were not just oppressed by the British, but by the French. We are very fond of saying that we were 7 times British and 7 times French, almost romantically. But we cannot continue to romanticize oppression. There is no colonial government, whether French or British, that was less oppressive than the one before it. So we had double oppression in St. Lucia. We couldn't breathe. They were down our necks for years of what they called a fight for hegemony in the region. And when the British finally won out on the French in 1804, our people who had been fighting, our people that we call the Nègbois, the Nègmaouan, those people who were resistance fighters, people who were fighting for our freedom, they were packed on a ship and sent to Britain, to the Tower of London, where they died and remained until we became aware of what had become of them when they were asking for repatriation back to Africa. That is how they were repatriated, by being put in prison. We have to recognize that the continued oppression, because of that hegemony that they were fighting for, remains. It remains in the Caribbean, and this Caribbean remains a colonized Caribbean. We cannot be truly independent when we continue to have waters that are owned by France, Britain, and the Dutch in our region. We have to continue to fight for the decolonization of our countries. Even independence is not an end in itself. We still have a colonial government that we continue to revere as if they are our saviors. As if they are our saviors. Let us move towards true independence by removing that colonial yoke from around our necks. Give us reparations. St. Lucians have always been at the forefront for reparatory justice. Whether it was with the running away from the plantations, whether it was with regard to refusal to work. Recall Petronille from the Fondo estate, who decided one day that she was no longer working, and the planter took her and tied her upside down in the hothouse. And she died. And when the stipendiary magistrates asked, why did you put this woman to hang upside down in the hothouse so that she would die? He replied, this blasted woman, she never gave me any respect. She always talked back to me. And that was part of our call for relieving the stress that we had on us as enslaved people. We called for reparations by fighting for our freedom. We were freedom fighters. We called for reparations even after emancipation, when the surveyor from La Clery, John Quinlan, stepped forward in the Royal Commission and asked for compensation for the work of these poor people who had not been granted compensation. Then when we look at the work of Sir Arthur Lewis, you see the continuum. So it is not today that we're asking for reparations. We have always asked for reparations, and we will continue to ask, even in light of the fact that there seems to be no remorse from those people who colonize us. We will continue to fight for reparations.